So yes, I'm going to be talking about myth stripping Persephone. And first of all, before I get started, I would like to thank the organizers, of course, for this wonderful conference that you've all put together. I don't think I have ever felt quite just so enthused and just cheerful and light, being able to talk about queer topics in the field in recent memory, definitely. So thank you all so much for that. I also have to give a shout out to one of my close friends and colleagues, Forever Moon, for helping me format some of this PowerPoint because they do it all the time for their jobs, and I have actually always been woefully terrible at them. So thank you for your aesthetic guidance, Forever. I deeply appreciated it. So yes, I'm going to be talking about a graphic novel series called The Wicked and the Divine. So first of all, there we go. I would like to situate myself exactly in what I'm thinking through, especially theory-wise. So we have, what kind of queer are you? Me specifically, I am a Black femme. That is how I identify. I also tend to call myself a bit of an existentialist, though I'd say my loved ones tend to be more existentialist than I. But there are definitely two sort of realms around queer theory that I was thinking of specifically for this comic book that we're going to be discussing. The first is in Alice Walker's home as Black femme. I have to acknowledge always that I live in a house that Black lesbians built, and so I have to usually acknowledge that structure. And the person I tend to identify most with is Alice Walker and her uses of womanism, of which I'm going to read one definition aloud for you from her seminal work, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Says, womanist, a woman who loves other women, sexually and or non-sexually, appreciates and prefers women's culture, women's emotional flexibility, values tears as natural counterbalance of laughter, and women's strength. Sometimes loves individual men, sexually and or non-sexually, committed to survival and wholeness of entire people, male and female. Not a separatist, except periodically for health. Traditionally universalist, as in, Mama, why are we brown, pink, and yellow and our cousins are white, beige, and black? Answer, well, you know, the colored race is just like a flower garden with every color flower represented. Traditionally capable, as in, Mama, I'm walking to Canada and I'm taking you and a bunch of other slaves with me. Reply, it wouldn't be the first time. And so in conjunction with womanism, I'm also thinking about this very interesting utilization of queer theory and the death drive that Lee Edelman has brought up in his book, No Futures, Queer Theory and the Death Drive. And specifically, there's one term that he talks about that is, I find very, very interesting and sparks a lot of fruitful conversation, especially around the wicked and the divine, which is on reproductive futurism. And so his book is all about children, and especially children, the death drive and queer theory, where he situates children as sort of the linchpin of our universal politics of reproductive futurism, where he argues that since the child tends to be representative of innocence in need of protection, it represents the possibility of the future, which the queer is usually positioned as the embodiment of a relentlessly narcissistic, antisocial, and future negating drive. For those of you who were at SES a little over a month ago, you might have gone to the Women's Classical Caucus panel. Think of the children in this sense of, we tend to say, and this idea of holding children as this very innocent potential for the futures that we should all sort of build or collectively do moral and ethical work for. But again, it is, whose children are we thinking of? Because certainly in lots of those senses, people are not thinking of the potential, the possibility of queer children. And is this return to children and reproductive potentials for the future that I will be wanting to return to later with the narratives that are brought up in The Wicked and the Divine. And then that's also just me with a cat, which, because that is also what kind of queer I am. And sorry, next slide, go. Go, sorry. There we go. But first, before I can actually dive into the wicked and the divine, I have to talk about this term myth stripping that I've kind of just thrown at all of you, because I'm sure upon when you first read the title of this paper, you were a bit confused about what exactly myth stripping was and why there are so many slashes and dashes in the middle of it. So myth stripping is a term that I have been coining slowly over the past year, and have been clearly feeling different ways about it, considering I keep breaking it up in different senses of the way. But it comes from many different sort of types of thoughts or analyses of different sorts of media. Originally, I was looking at literature, but then started branching off into what is literature when I started looking at things like comic books. But I was also looking at different ways of producing stories and myths. And a lot of this was rooted originally in actually quilting traditions that came out of the African American community of assembling different types of strips together. And so I started thinking through strips as different ways of dissembling myths. And then I started sort of playing with words. So we'll look at sort of three different concepts around myth stripping. So first, there is the myth stripping, which is assemblages, dissemblages of strips of cloth, of clothing in a way to disorient myths, myths that are aslant, a myth striptease, myth removal, myth deprivation, a barring of myth, myths as comic strips, myths circling a pole. Then we get to the notion of myths tripping, myth stumbling, myth blitz, myth snags, myths fallings, myths in momentary suspension, mythic journeys, myths catching your foot, lightly running myths, there and back again myths, sleight of mind myths, the relationship between myths and pharmacology, or tripping in that sense. And then myths plus ripping, myths that tear, myths forcibly separated, myth splitting, myths as a meeting of currents producing fast flowing and rough waters, myth ripples, rupturing myth fabrications in different sense. And so this is clearly a new term and one that I'm still working on, but also as a vested anti-capitalist, I'm always trying to think of new ways, new queer economies that we can come to, of new ways of sort of challenging power and sort of resituating ourselves. And so using this terminology that originally I was looking at when applying it to mostly African-American reception of classical myth, I was realizing I perhaps needed to lean more into some of its potential for queer identity too. Partly because a lot of my rooting in my queer identity is also rooting in my racial identity as well. Sorry. No, back. There we go. So finally, we come to the wicked and the divine. So the wicked and the divine is actually an incredibly difficult comic to describe, because I would say its summary changes every single volume that it adds, as it adds more and more layers to the myth. But very briefly explained, it reorients all of myth in the world into this different narrative, which is that every 90 years, 12 gods return to the earth as young people. They are loved, they are hated. In 2 years, they are all dead. And currently in the time space of the comic, the year is 2014. And this is the most recent, what is called the recurrence of the gods coming back. And so as you can imagine, this is fascinating. 12 different gods, and usually coming from any pantheon around the world, every 90 years, depending on where they are in the world, reassembling into all of these different forms. And they always find 12 bodies of youths. They're always usually in their teenagers, perhaps early 20s, but that's the oldest. And so these youths become gods for 2 years, and then they all die. And so I sort of include this left panel here because this is sort of the standard panel you see at most, especially that first sentence, usually what happens after it changes from panel to panel. Then I also included this 1, 2, 3, 4, which is this interesting numerical motif that happens a lot throughout the comic. And I have a lot of feelings about it. I'm sort of still thinking about it, especially thinking through numerology and how that relates to the queer. But if folks have more thoughts about that, I would be very eager in the discussion. So in this tale, I'm going to be talking about one character in particular that I'm going to delve into other members of the pantheon. One 17-year-old Laura Wilson, who becomes the goddess Persephone, and then unbecomes the goddess Persephone through a very interesting twist of events, as I will show you. But Laura is our central figure that we're going to be looking at. She is one that I tend to identify with a lot. She is a mixed race girl, just on the cusp of trying to understand who she is, what she wants. And she is a fan of the gods. She has been studying the gods for most of her life. She has gone to the different conventions to talk about the gods of the recurrence, which, you know, up until the recurrence happens for her as a teenager, it's this idea of something that happened way back in the 1920s, but no one really knows. There's no video footage. Like, is this a real thing? We're not sure. So she's a very passionate lover of myth. She is a young queer woman who's exploring her identity in multiple different ways, especially through her hair and makeup, as we'll see. And she is a fascinating character with which to sort of look at how these ideas of myth stripping sort of enable her to deal with myth in this very interesting and transformative way that I would argue is far, far different than we usually see in classical reception. And then briefly, these are the three areas that we're going to be looking at with queerness in relationship to ancient myth. First of all, katabasis, which is going down, which tends to allude to chthonic or underworld narratives that happen within myths. Cosmetics, which is a proposed branch of ancient aesthetics that I'm actually proposing, that focuses on the Greek sense of the word cosmos, or good order, which can be understood in the sense of style or makeup, in the sense of the order of a good city, but as well as the broader sort of cosmos. And so I'm looking at sort of this idea of makeup to see how we make up things, make up ourselves, make up our lives, make up others. And then obviously mythopoesis, the literal makeup, making up or creation, production of myth. And so I want to look at how these three very, very ancient concepts of myths are actually utilized for this very queer narrative that Laura goes through with the goddess Persephone as she's wrestling with this identity that she's trying to understand if it's really hers or if it isn't. So first, katabasis and the queer. The first thing we get is a pretty straightforward queering of a popular katabatic narrative. We have the narrative of Persephone and Hades, but in this case, it is Laura, before she has become Persephone, with the god Lucifer, who has found himself in a female body, and so goes by Luci in these times, tends to style herself in the iconography of David Bowie. And she, and so the two of them have this initial sort of engagement with each other, but of course it doesn't go in the traditional sense that you would imagine for the myth of Persephone and Hades. Luci, by the end of the first graphic novel volume, loses her head, in fact. She doesn't die, she just loses her head though, so she is presumed dead for quite the long time. Sorry. My slideshow keeps like freezing. I'm sorry. I keep trying to go to the next one. There we go. But also in the sense of katabasis, we don't just have traditional chthonic myths, we do have an interesting sort of reflection of that chthonicness into the contemporary, and especially contemporary culture. And we see this most prevalently with the chthonic gods. And so one of these gods in particular that opens up the story is the Morrigan, who Persephone goes down in this very katabatic sort of sense, as you can see in the three panels. into the underground to explore this new sort of underground music and underground space. However, the underground is ruled by a king and queen who tend to be pretty heteronormative in everything that they do, and it is a bit of a chaotic space, specifically Baphomet and the Morrigan, that others. And so we actually get an introduction of Dionysus into the chthonic scene to sort of reorient what it means to be a chthonic god. And Dionysus is a very different figure. He sort of is a DJ who keeps the party going nonstop. His body, his influence in and of itself is its own strange pharmacology. And he's asexual too. And then finally, Persephone herself goes in her own katabasis as she becomes, or Laura goes through her own katabasis in and of itself as she becomes Persephone. But in the moment of her katabasis, she actually loses everything. The primary goddess of the pantheon, Ananke, after giving her these powers, immediately tries to kill her. She fails, but then turns and kills Laura's entire family. And so while this isn't traditionally a way that a queer person upon coming out might lose their family, it is still these interesting echoes and resonances with different queer narratives that Laura seems to be exploring. Then we get to cosmetic. First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge many of the gods throughout the series just literally draw their inspiration from different icons, and especially queer icons at that, most notably in large here, Lucifer as this femme David Bowie, and Inanna, Queen of Heaven, as Prince. And then we also get things like Sahkmet here as Rihanna, but also past occurrences too lean on past iconographies. In the 1800s occurrence, Lucifer was Lord Byron, Woden was Mary Wollstonecraft, the Morrigan was Percy Shelley. Like, it's a very interesting and eclectic group of gods, and they really do play on what makes celebrity, what makes pop stars, and also our ideas of superheroes, but then also how that reflects in our own ideas of myth and image making as well. And I'm trying to speed this up because I think I just passed my time limit, but I did want to mention specifically the figure of Cassandra, because I know this will stay pretty Persephone heavy as I hook into the end. But Cassandra is the one sort of like, I don't want to say naysayer of the pantheon, but she is very distinct in that she does not believe that they are gods, even as she is literally turned into the Norse god Erd, the Norn of fate. And so she spends most of her godhood trying to convince everyone that they aren't. But she is also Japanese woman. She is also a trans woman. So she has a very different experience of culture and gender than, say, her godly counterpart Amaterasu, who is a young white girl who thinks that she is the Japanese god of the sun. And obviously has the sun powers, and so can prove this. But their reactions and their interactions with each other are such an interesting look and lens. And I actually just wanted to flag, urge for everyone, that I think that she is one of the most, I think, compelling looks at the intersections of gender and race in this whole comic, especially when it comes to cultural appropriation. And I found a lot of her conversations with Amaterasu really resonant, I think, of a lot of conversations around, especially things like cultural appropriation and drag culture that I'd seen on shows such as RuPaul's Drag Race when they became more popularized. And so I think she's a really good figure to think through the lens of that. But ultimately, cosmetics do come together to make these amazing gods, but that is not all they are. And that is sort of the entire arc with Laura throughout the series. She is made up, she becomes this very intense, impressive goddess, Persephone. But then at the end of everything, she gives everything up, but she still has this ability, this capacity to create and to make miracles. And so she has to ask, you know, what am I? Like, once I take all the hair, all of the makeup, all of the powers, all of this other stuff off, like, I still do have this like tiny grain of who I may or potentially could be. And so finally, very quickly, mythopoetic and the queer. And I wish I could, I was originally planning to just read all these panels, but instead I'm going to summarize them really quickly. That this entire narrative that is being described in The Wicked of the Divine, specifically of these gods occurring every 90 years, all goes back to 6,000 years in the past, when the original and very first Ananke and Persephones decided to sort of meddle with fate and figure out a way to sort of trick time. Ananke, because she fears death and does not want to die, and so is constantly turning herself into a maiden, into a crone, with Persephone as this weird sort of mother figure to help the pantheons along the entire time. But ultimately, it's fascinating because Ananke has spent the past 6,000 years killing her sister over and over again, every 90 years, in increasingly interesting ways. Though sometimes it does show that she doesn't kill Persephone right away, but presumably each time Persephone does have to die in order for the story to continue and carry on. But I did want to end here and highlight with these sisters and the fact that Ananke has been creating all of these narratives, all because she's actually terrified of a lie of heteronormativity. The one thing she thinks that will defeat her in the entirety is if the goddess Persephone eventually becomes pregnant, because that's what Persephone tells her. She says, like, if my god has a child, your god will no longer cease to be, because the whole maiden, mother, crone sort of triad is going to be interrupted finally. But Persephone admits, like, in sort of the past, she's like, oh, I lied. Like, that's a lie. Like, who believes that? Like, what? And it's proven interestingly in the story because Laura actually does become pregnant by one of her fellow male gods. And she ends up actually having an abortion and not having the child. And so Ananke is just like, haha, I have won. Like, this is clearly like it. And that's the moment when Laura decides to give up godhead for good, because she's a scared teenager who doesn't quite know what to do with her life and realizes that's exactly who she is. But the point of this entire thing that Persephone set up was not for this strange gambit for Ananke to be defeated by, of this like interesting sort of like mothering happening, but rather she says that we must have faith within the children. The children have to figure a way out of their narrative. They have to break out of it. And so this is one of, I made this the final slide because here we see, first, this is Eleanor, who becomes Lucifer, her fall, literal fall into Lucifer, and sort of this narrative that we see played out over Laura's fall into Persephone with Ananke there. But then finally, in the end, as Eleanor's can't really quite come to grips with the fact that she, doesn't want to give up being Lucifer, it's Laura that sort of has to like climb down into the pit with her to change their narrative, to sort of imagine that they can actually live past this sort of doomed curse that they've been raised for, that they can actually have their futures together, that in the end, essentially, they will live. And that's exactly what they do. They do end up living late into old age. Cassandra gets to eulogize herself at her own funeral, where most of the characters have actually managed to survive and live into this time. Not all of them did, but quite a few did. And that in and of itself is impressive. It's something that literally has not happened with another group of the Pantheon in over 6,000 years. And yet they were still able to do it. And so that is why I wanted to introduce you all to this character of Laura and the interesting ways in which she deals with myth, in this sense of myth stripping, of putting Persephone on, but then also having to take her off and realize the fabrication of this myth. But also the ways in which these sort of ancient concepts of myth sort of reflect back onto this very fascinating queer character, and in fact actually help aid into her queer narratives and trying to find potential queer futures. As I sort of mentioned earlier with Edelman's piece, this idea of children sort of being this potential. I love The Wicked and Divine because it really does invert a lot of that narrative. And it really does show how children can be their own potential to seize their own queer futures. I just wanted to end very, very briefly, I'm not going to read the whole thing, on this one quote from one of my favorite songs, How to Hair by Esperanza Spalding. Because one of the sort of first things I noticed about Laura is she goes through a lot of very intense hair changes throughout every volume of the comic pretty much. And so I wanted to just read this last part here. Whose image have we been made in, composed for, orchestrated by? Our principals eye the concert master, ignoring the mumbling audience situating late to their seat or standing room only stance in this stately hall built for silence, while bulbs blearily focus on our loudness. Writhing out the glowing dark, us, a priceless all-toned flood rising to nourish everyone down to the last stray strand. I raise my palm in praise of the symphonic nappiness haloing your head. I raise my palm in praise of the God-given nappiness haloing your head. I raise my palm in praise of the beautiful nappiness haloing your head. And in that vein, I wanted to thank you all for sitting here and listening to me as I've gone over. I'm not going to take any more of your time, but I greatly look forward to the conversation later. And I hope this has inspired all of you to read a bit of The Wicked and the Divine. So thank you so much.